Alright guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we are going to be upgrading the cams and valve springs on my B58 engine. You guys might remember a couple months ago we talked about the new Kelford cams that were coming on the market when they officially announced all the specs and different options that were going to be available, and they agreed to send me out a set so that I could create some content for you guys, show you how it's all installed, and we'll also do some testing with it to see how much power the car will put down even on just a stock turbo setup. So I got the Stage 1 Gen 1 B58 upgraded camshafts along with the valve springs, and we're going to be doing this in like a 4-part series. So part 1 will show you how to install the intake cam, part 2 will be the exhaust cam, and then part 3 will be the valve springs. And in the future we'll do a part 4 to show the actual results. We'll get on the dyno, do some custom tuning, and all of that good stuff. So yeah, stick around for all of those videos. Keep in mind, if you've been around on the channel for a while, you know I try to create these DIYs to show you how easy it is to install different parts on your car and what you can do from home. This might not be the case, I'll be completely honest. It was a little tricky, it requires a lot of specialty tools, so this might just give you some motivation to drop it off at a shop. But either way, I thought it would be cool to show you guys how it's done. So yeah, hopefully you find this video useful.
Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future.
Now, I want to put a couple disclaimers out there before we jump into this. So first of all, I did not do this in the order that I would recommend. If you're doing everything, what I recommend doing is removing the intake cam, then the exhaust cam, then the valve springs, and then the installation is the reverse of that. So install the valve springs, then the exhaust cam, then the intake cam. Like I said, I didn't do it that way because I thought it would be easier doing it differently. So you might see different cams pop in and pop out of order and things that you don't expect. Just kind of try to ignore that if you can. Focus on the details of the specific one we're discussing in this video for that step. But if you're doing all of it in a specific order, that's the sequence that I would do it in to give you the easiest time lining up all the timing components and everything when you're completing the job. Another thing is a lot of people ask me how to know which one they should order, if it's Gen 1 or Gen 1.5. And it's pretty easy to see. What you're going to have to do is go to the back of your valve cover and remove the Vanos actuator and put a small mirror back there, and you can see the head of the central valve. So if it is a regular hex head bolt, then that is going to be a Gen 1. If it is a spline head, then it's going to be a Gen 1.5. So that's the easiest way to tell. It does change depending on model years, but I would prefer for you guys just to confirm it by pulling the Vanos actuator and just looking at it. You can tell the difference immediately just by looking at the top of the central valve. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump into the DIY.
So to start things off, we're going to need to remove our valve cover and our charge pipe to access all the components we need. I've already posted a DIY on how to remove the valve cover, so I'll put a link down in the description. But for now, we'll just fast forward, so swipe, and now we are ready to start removing the cams. So now we are in a position to start replacing the cams, and the principle behind this is pretty simple. You know, your Vanos gears towards the back do not have any timing marks. They are not keyed to the cams. They're actually just bolted to the cam by that central valve. So you're going to need to lock the cams into position in order to set the time on your car, and you lock both of the cams and you lock the crank as well. And then you can mess with the timing chain stuff in order to, you know, swap out these components. So there are a lot of special tools. I'll show you guys that as we go through it, but if you need the tools, there will be a link down in the description where you can buy the exact kit that I'm using so you know that you have all the tools you need. So at this point, we need to set the engine to top dead center, and that requires accessing the crank pulley, and we can't do that with this fan shroud in place. So we're going to go ahead and remove it. The first step is to unplug this wiring harness that's going to the fan shroud. And then once you've unplugged it, there is a little clip holding it onto the shroud. So you're just going to use a small screwdriver to pop that clip off, and then we can tuck the wiring harness out of the way. Then we're going to need to remove the fan shroud straight up out of the engine bay. There's usually a screw on the passenger side. Mine is missing, but if you have that, go ahead and remove it. And then on the driver's side of the bay, there is a little clip that's holding a tab on the fan shroud in place. So I'm sticking a flathead screwdriver in there to push the tab down, and then that allows you to pull the fan straight up. Keep in mind there are a lot of hoses here. Everything is in the way. It's not easy, so just take your time, kind of tilt it around and shake it until it fully comes up and out of the engine bay. Now I like to stick something down the spark plug hole in order to easily identify top dead center. If you have something thin enough, you might be able to put it down the fuel injector hole, but I don't. So I went ahead and removed the spark plug, and after you've pulled it out, you can put something down the hole. Like in my case, I'm using a long flathead screwdriver, and that just makes sure that you can see the position of the piston while you're turning the crank. And then this is the actual timing kit. So this is everything that you get with that kit that I post from Amazon, and it comes with a lot of stuff. It has stuff to hold down the cams, to line up the crank. It even has this piece that is technically supposed to be used to remove the Vanos actuator, so I haven't really used it, but that's what that's for. So to start things off, we are going to use this piece, and this will actually fit down here on the crank. And then we can use that to actually turn the crank and find top dead center. So we're going to use the tool with a socket wrench and just keep turning the crank. The piston is going to go down to the bottom of its stroke, and then it's going to come all the way up to the top of its stroke. And while you're turning it, you'll actually see the screwdriver stop moving for a second, and that lets you know that it's pretty much at top dead center. Now, BMW also included a couple other indicators so you can make sure the cams are in the right position. On the exhaust cam, it should say this BMW A. You should see that pointed straight up. And on the intake cam, it should say BMW E. Again, pointed straight up so that you know it's in the right position. You can also look where the cams are going to be locked down. There should be like a flat, and that should be parallel with the flat of your cylinder head. So again, that should be pointed straight up if you're looking at it from this angle. And then lastly, you can just kind of look at the lobes on cylinder 1. So here's what the intake cam looks like, and here's what the exhaust cam looks like. So just make sure your cam lobes are matched up to how this looks. Next, we're going to put down the cam locking tool. So the first thing is this big bracket that hovers over everything, and there are 2 long screws. These are going to go through some of the holes for the valve cover. So you're basically going to screw this down behind it, and that will hold it in place. And then you're going to put 2 brackets, one on each of the cams. The short bracket is going to go on the intake cam, and then you have 2 screws on top that hold that down. Just slide the bracket back and forth if you need to in order to line up the holes. And then on the exhaust cam, you're going to use one of the long brackets. And then same thing, put the 2 screws on top, and that will hold it in place. It only really needs to be finger tight. You don't need to torque it down to a specific specification. Next, we're going to need to access the tensioner, and that requires removing the heat shield on top of the turbo. So in order to access it, we're going to pull these O2 sensor harness wires out of the way, and then you're going to undo the bolts that are holding the heat shield in place. I can't remember, they're either T40 or T45, but unscrew those, and then you can pull the heat shield off. And now we can access the tensioner. So it's way back behind cylinder 6. You can see it basically just looks like a bolt in the side of the block. So you're going to get a 21mm socket in order to unscrew that. I can't really show it on camera just because of the location, but reach back there with your socket and you can unscrew it. And this is how it looks when it's removed. You can basically see, again, it just looks like a bolt, and oil pressure pushes that piston out to keep tension on the chain. And just make sure you have some paper towels underneath it because a lot of oil is going to come out and you want to minimize that mess. But yeah, it's that easy. Now at this point, I recommend just taking a video as evidence of how everything is installed. Anything that you remove needs to be sequenced and laid out so that you can reinstall it in the exact same order. The numbers on there don't matter. Sometimes they have different part numbers and stuff. What's most important is the sequence and the orientation of each of these caps, the springs, the covers. Everything that you're removing needs to be reinstalled the exact same way that it was removed. So if you take a video like this, it just gives you a little more assurance. If you get things mixed up slightly, then you can make sure that you reinstall it correctly. Now again, for all the Gen 1 B58 owners, there are two different types of central valves. If you're like me and you have the Gen 1 version, you're going to need a 22mm socket in order to remove it. If you have a Gen 1.5, then you're going to need this adapter in order to remove it, and this comes with the timing kit, so you don't need to buy it separately. So yeah, just make sure you get the kit so you have all the tools you need. Now, at this point, I was really struggling. I just underestimated how tight the central valves were. I put the 22mm socket on there square, and I still couldn't get it off. So I ended up removing this part of the firewall. There are 2 Torx screws and a couple 10mm nuts that you need to remove. And then you can pull off this upper firewall plastic. It's just kind of tucked in here on the passenger side, and basically just remove the part that was in my way. Now, even then, I still wasn't quite able to get enough leverage, but this gave me enough room to get my breaker bar in here. So I pulled out Lucille and basically put her behind the hood so I could get enough leverage, and that allowed me to break these central valves free. Once it's broken free, you can finish unscrewing the central valve by hand. And here you can see what it looks like. It basically has a threaded body, a couple holes in the side so that oil can flow in and out, and it has a screen at the base so it can make sure no deposits go where they shouldn't go. And then you can slide off the Vanos gear from the cam. Now, keep in mind there's not a lot of space here with all of the timing lock components and stuff in place. So just take your time, be patient, and you should be able to get it off of the timing chain. Now, these do have to be reinstalled on the correct cam, and you can tell which one is which because, like here you see on the intake Vanos gear, there is an IN for intake, so you can make sure that you put that back on the correct cam. And if you look at the exhaust gear, you can see that it has EX for exhaust. So again, that'll just help ensure you put it back in the right spot. And now we can remove the timing tools. So you'll go ahead and unscrew those 2 screws from each bracket, lift it off, and then you can unscrew the 2 screws that are holding the main mount in place, and then remove the mount as well. Next, we're going to pull the cam follower out of the high pressure fuel pump mount. So just use a pick tool to stick it down there, kind of hook it under the outside, and then you should be able to pull it straight up and out of the mount. Next, we're going to remove the cam bearing caps on the exhaust cam, and yes, that does include the high pressure fuel pump mount. At that location, it basically acts as the cam bearing, so we're going to be removing that as well. Now, this is the sequence that BMW specifies you remove it in, but there is one thing that you should note, that at top dead center, the exhaust cam is going to have the valve springs on cylinder 2 compressed. So that means it's going to be under tension, and when you remove the cam bearing caps in that location, it's basically going to push up on the cam. So BMW does have a tool that mounts onto the cylinder head and keeps those springs compressed, and it just makes sure that the cam isn't under tension or getting twisted or anything when you're removing it. I didn't have that tool, so what I did was I removed the cam bearing cap at cylinder 2 last, and while I was loosening it, I just jiggled the cam a little bit to make sure that it came up as straight as possible, and it was completely released from all of the different, bearing locations. So just take your time with that. Also, this cap at the back was a little bit difficult for me to remove, and it does have these little edges underneath each corner where you can stick a flathead screwdriver or something under there and twist it to help it pop up. So if it sticks a little bit, just use those features to remove it from the cylinder head. And again, just make sure you have everything laid out in order so that you can reinstall it in the same sequence and the same orientation. This is how I had it all laid out for me, so I could see the cam, all the bearings, the actuator, and the actual Vanos gear at the back with the tensioner. Next, you're going to unpack the actual exhaust cam, and this one is really straightforward. It's not like the intake cam where you have to swap components over or anything. You basically just take it out of the package and it is good to go. Just take a good look at it, make sure there's no damage, scoring, etc., and then we'll be ready to reinstall it into your cylinder head. Now it's time for the most important step. You must make sure that you lubricate all of the mating components so that you don't experience any accelerated wear or damage when you do the first start of the engine. Now, there is assembly lube included with the kit, and that is recommended. However, I don't really like using it because it can gum up your oil and clog up your oil filter. It does work really well, though, because it's thick and tacky, so it'll stay in place, and you know it'll be there when you start your car. So if you do use it, I just highly recommend changing your oil within about 50 miles. And again, after about 500 miles to make sure you get it all out of your oil system. Since I'm going to be starting my car less than 24 hours after installing the cams, I just went ahead and used oil. So you can see me squirting it on all the lobes, all of the bearing surfaces, basically everywhere that I know will be seeing RPM and metal to metal contact. Next, we're going to install all of the cam bearing caps, and like usual, there is a tightening sequence for these bolts, but the first thing I recommend is just tightening everything down by hand. Basically snug up the screws on all of the cam caps once they're seated, and then you're going to torque down the cam by basically turning each screw by a half turn in the tightening sequence. So go back and forth to each screw, and that will torque down the cam completely flat. Make sure it doesn't have any twists or bends in it. And then when you do the final torquing, you will, of course, still follow the same sequence and make sure you hit the required torque spec. And then you'll reinstall the cam follower, and you can see there's a little notch in the high pressure fuel pump mount where that tab on the follower fits in. So just rotate it to make sure the tab is aligned, and it should drop straight down. Next, we reassemble the Vanos system. So you're going to grab your Vanos gear with the EX on it for exhaust, and we're going to slide that onto the back of the exhaust cam. Again, it can be a little bit difficult to line up the Vanos gear with the timing chain and get all of those teeth to engage. So just move the chain out of the way, center the Vanos gear on the exhaust cam, and then try to line up the teeth while pushing the Vanos gear onto the cam itself. So just take your time, make sure all of that is lined up, and then you're going to grab your central valve, and that is going to fit right through the center of the Vanos gear. That should just screw in nice and smooth. If there's any resistance, back it off, center it, and make sure it's all lined up, and then screw it in again. Next, we need to put the engine back in time, and in order to do that, we're going to jack up the front of the car and remove the under tray underneath the engine so that we can access the crank and lock it at top dead center. Now, there are two different ways that you can do this. If you have an automatic car, you're going to need to remove this starter so that we can access the flywheel, and then we put a pin through it so that it locks it at top dead center. If you have a manual transmission car, then you're going to be looking for this yellow plug on the side of the engine, and you're basically going to use that same pin, but push it through that hole when you put the car at top dead center, and that will lock the crank. So since we have an automatic car, we're going to remove the starter. There are two nuts that need to be loosened on the front to remove these cables. And then once you've removed that, there are 3 eTorx bolts that need to be removed. And you can see they're pretty long, but once you pull those bolts out, then the starter should just drop straight down. Next, we're going to mount up the alignment bracket for the locking pin. And there should be 2 bolts inside of your timing kit that will screw this onto the bottom of your engine, and this just makes sure that the locking pin is aligned to the correct position to make sure your crank is at top dead center. Luckily, I already had the crank pretty much at top dead center, so you can see the hole is right there. I just had to give it a couple of nudges in the right direction until I was able to push the pin all the way in and lock it. Now, this was one of those instances where I realized I didn't do things in the best order. If you're only swapping the exhaust cam, you won't have this issue, but if you're doing the intake and exhaust at the same time, I highly recommend installing the intake cam first. What you're going to find is when you install the central valve on the exhaust cam, as you tighten it, it's going to turn the cam in the wrong direction because you still need to compress that cylinder 2 valve spring. If you turn it in the right direction to compress the valve springs, it loosens the central valve. So the best way to do this is to have the intake cam still installed. Install your timing chain, and what you're going to do is turn the crank so that it can turn the exhaust cam to top dead center. You might have to do this a couple times, remove the central valve, remove the Vanos gear, turn the crank backwards a little bit, then reinstall the Vanos and turn the crank some more. But do that until you get everything to top dead center, and you'll be able to install this bracket square with the cylinder head, and that will tell you that you've got it in the right position. Next, you're going to reattach your timing tools so that you can put your Vanos gear on and tighten down your Vanos central valve. Now, the actual torque spec will vary depending on which central valve you have. If you have the Gen 1 version like me, then you're going to torque it to 30 Newton meters, then 50 Newton meters, then it gets a 65-degree angle of rotation. And I actually had to pull Lucille back out to get that angle because it goes to a crazy amount of torque. At this point, it definitely made more sense why it was so hard to remove. If you have the spline head or the Gen 1.5 version, you're going to need to torque it to 50 Newton meters and then torque it to 140 Newton meters. So again, just pay attention to the torque spec based on the central valve your car has. Finally, you'll reinstall your timing chain tensioner, and then you're done with all the timing tools, so you can remove those screws and take the brackets off. So at this point, we basically just need to reassemble everything. You put your valve cover back on, reassemble your ignition system and your fuel system. One thing I do recommend is doing a prime. So leave your injectors unplugged, go back in the car, press the start button, and let it crank for 10 seconds or so. That will drive the mechanical oil pump so that it pushes oil through all the galleys, and again just helps make sure that all of your components are lubricated before it revs up to thousands of RPM, and that should help you get the reliability you need out of these new upgraded cams. So yeah, I think that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.